but the modern local people there call it Tel Al-Amarna. So we call this the Amarna period, the Amarna era. Amarna doesn't just refer to that town. It refers to the whole period, the art, everything involved. And it's all interconnected. Now, as you remember, Akhenaten tried to change the religion to monotheism. And it didn't work. When he died after 17 years of reign, everything went back to the old ways. Now, he left as his successor his son, Tutankhamun, young Tutankhamun, who had an advisor. Now, he was only 8 years old or so when he became king, so he's not calling the shots, he's not making the decisions. Somebody's making the decisions for him. And the best bet is that it's a man named Aye, who becomes the vizier of Egypt, the equivalent of the prime minister, advising Tutankhamun, who had served under Akhenaten. Now, it's Aye, if you'll remember, who succeeds Tutankhamun by marrying the widow of Tutankhamun, young Ankhesenamun. Aye is probably 60 years old when he succeeds Tutankhamun. Right? He's an older man by Egyptian standards, certainly, when he becomes the next king of Egypt. There are only two more pharaohs in the 18th dynasty, Aye and his successor, Horemheb. But it's all interconnected. As you'll see, this is all what we call the Amarna period. It's an unusual period for Egyptian history. What you'll see is we're going to have 3 kings in a row who don't leave any children. And that leads to turmoil. Who's going to become king? The first of those 3 kings was Tutankhamun. If you'll remember, in his tomb, 2 fetuses were found, probably miscarriages of Ankhesenamun. Both little girls. One was about 8 months, one was about 5 months. But Tutankhamun did not leave a successor. But we know that Aye becomes king of Egypt. Now, remember, Aye started his career at Amarna. He was in with the pharaoh, Akhenaten. There are scenes of him on his tomb wall at Amarna, when he thought he was going to die there, at Amarna, of him and his wife. They're worshiping the Aten. So he was kind of politically correct. He was worshiping the Aten. He was in with Akhenaten. But as soon as Akhenaten dies, it's Aye who says, let's forget this new religion. Let's go back to polytheism. Let's change all the ways. He has Tutankhaten change his name to Tutankhamun. Remember, he wasn't born Tutankhamun. And then he says, we're going back to Thebes. So he's the one who's calling the shots, and he's sort of guiding Tutankhamun in the early days. Now, but he becomes pharaoh. He doesn't last long. As I say, by Egyptian standards, he's an old man. You know, the life expectancy is perhaps, from birth to death in the ancient world is about 30s or so. He's 60s. He lasts only 3 years. He is king for approximately 3 years, between 3 and 4 years, and then dies and is buried in his tomb. Now, what's important is where his tomb is. And you'll see it's politics that determines it, not looking for the best site necessarily. Aye is buried in the Western Valley. Now remember, 18th dynasty, Thutmose I has the first tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And from him on, the 18th dynasty kings are buried in the Valley of the Kings, that main valley, until Amenhotep III, the great king who has Egypt at its greatness. Amenhotep III decided to put his tomb way off in the Western Valley, a spur of the Valley of the Kings. That's where Aye has his tomb. Now you might wonder, why does he have his tomb off with Amenhotep III? Why is it there? Well, it's a political reason. He didn't begin that tomb for himself. That tomb was begun for Tutankhamun. Not only did Aye take Tutankhamun's wife, he took his tomb. You see, as soon as you became king, you started building your tomb. And when Tutankhamun makes the journey from Amarna back to Thebes, he has to pick a site for his tomb. Now, Aye is his advisor. Tutankhamun's maybe 9 years old by now, perhaps. And Aye suggests, probably picks, I don't mean to say suggest, he probably tells him, the Western Valley. Why the Western Valley? The answer is, it's a statement. And the statement is this. Remember, Tutankhamun's father was a heretic. He was viewed as the trouble. He was the problem. Nobody liked Akhenaten.
True.
Thieves. So when Tutankhamun's coming back, he's got to show, I'm a legitimate king. I've got royal blood in my veins. But he can't identify himself with his father, because he's the heretic. That's sort of bad. So I makes the decision, we'll bury you next to Grandpa. Amenhotep III is his grandfather, the great traditional king. So Tutankhamun's tomb is selected as right next to his grandfather's. It's a statement saying, I'm a traditional king. I'm not like my father. But Tutankhamun died suddenly, perhaps murdered. His tomb wasn't finished, barely started. So he was hastily buried in another tomb that was at least further along in construction in the Valley of the Kings. So he's quickly buried in the Valley of the Kings, the main part, leaving Tutankhamun's original tomb empty, and that's where Ai is buried. He takes Tutankhamun's tomb and his wife. The tomb is interesting, by the way, for another reason. Ai's tomb is quite similar to Tutankhamun's. Quite similar. Almost as if he wants to identify himself with Tutankhamun. Now, I think there's a reason for that. Tutankhamun must have been a very popular king, returning everything back to the good old days. Everybody's temples are going to be open again. The gods are back. So Ai is saying, I was with him. For example, on one of the walls in Tutankhamun's tomb, there's a scene of 12 baboons. These are 12 baboons that guide the boat of the solar god through the sky.
12 baboons?
Ai has the exact same scene on his wall. And if I had a bet, I would say it's the same artist who painted it even. If you look at it, it looks like the same hand. I've looked at it closely. I think it's probably the same artist. So Ai is saying,
thieving.
I'm establishment too. I'm a good guy. He even has a sarcophagus like Tutankhamun's. Right? So there are many, many similarities that Ai is trying to identify himself with Tutankhamun. The only thing he doesn't have on his wall is Ankhesenamun. She doesn't appear on the wall of Ai's tomb. We don't know why. Maybe she's dead by now, but she's not there. So Ai only reigns for 3 years. Dies. His tomb is robbed eventually. His name carved off the wall, as we've discussed. But next, Horemheb is the next pharaoh. Now, remember what I said, that Horemheb didn't leave children either, right? We're going to have 3 kings in a row with no children. Tutankhamun, no children. Ai, no children. And now we've got another pharaoh who's going to have no children.
That's crazy. You got like 3 or 4 different wives and mistresses. And you ain't got no kids? Not one? And it's not a matter of, oh, well, I can't take care of all these kids. You're the king. You're the prince. We know you got money to take care of the kids. With 3 rulers, and then one of y'all can, get it in and sprout some childrens. That's just crazy. Anyway, welcome back to another episode of Ancient Egypt. I recently started the segment on the Bible because I noticed there's a lot of what's the term I want to use? There's a lot of parallels between the Bible and ancient Egyptian culture. And I didn't want to get too far away from it to where people would forget about it. So, on the page, on the YouTube page, there's a section for the Bible verses, as well as the main section for ancient Egyptian history. And there'll also be one for American Negro history. So at times I'll be jumping back and forth, but I'll try to keep it as consistent as possible. After ancient Egypt, I want to start doing things in order by dates. 18th century, 19th century. Making a timeline. So with that being said, let's get back into it. Ooh, soup. Sorry.
Horemheb. What do we know about Horemheb? Well, the first is he's a military man. A career military man. He started his career probably under Amenhotep III, right? And when Akhenaten moved the capital and sort of let the military go, didn't support the military, Horemheb didn't go to the new capital. Horemheb stayed behind at Memphis. So he was probably pretty much languishing as Akhenaten lets the military go downhill. Horemheb is just sort of hanging out, not doing much. So he wouldn't be a supporter of Akhenaten under any circumstances. I mean, it's the old thing. It's sort of like the hawks and the doves, and Akhenaten is the dove, and Horemheb would certainly be the hawk, wanting strong military presence. So Horemheb began his career under Amenhotep III, probably languishes under Akhenaten for about 17 years. Remember, Akhenaten rules for 17 years, right? But then Tutankhamun comes into power. That's when we see Horemheb really go up. His stock goes up. He has the title of King's Deputy under Tutankhamun. It's a very important position. And he's a military man, strong law and order. He marries a woman named Mut-Nejemet. It's a great name, by the way. Mut is mother, Nejemet is sweet. So it's like sweet mama. That's what her name means, right? Mut-Nejemet. Some people think that she was the sister of Nefertiti. Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten. So some people think that Horemheb is trying to show, well, I'm a little bit related to the royal family. I don't think she really was the sister. It's the same name. Nefertiti did have a sister named Mut-Nejemet, but it doesn't mean that this is the new family Mut-Nejemet. It's a common name. But he marries this woman, Mut-Nejemet, right?
That's like a lot of people in the neighborhood named Peanut.
He's going to institute lots of new policies. Now, think about it. He's a military man. He is what we would call a law and order candidate, right? Straight arrow, firm. There's a wonderful statue of him in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was carved of him when he was the king's deputy, when he was working under Tutankhamun, right? And it shows Horemheb as a scribe. Now, Horemheb, it's even possible, just possible, that Horemheb was illiterate even. They couldn't read and write, because most Egyptians couldn't. But it shows him as a scribe. It's a position everybody wanted to be kind of seen as. He's sitting cross-legged. He's got a papyrus roll on his lap, right?
So, see, here we go again. All right. When it comes to social status in ancient Egypt, not everybody could read and write. It just wasn't a thing. You know, the wealthier you were, then the better off you were as far as the access to food, whether or not you could read and write. Because most slaves couldn't read and write. Now, that's not to say that Egypt had slaves all throughout their history, because they didn't have slaves from the very beginning. Technology wasn't as such that they could keep the slaves in line should they rebel. No, wasn't gonna happen. So, yeah, I'm thinking these people couldn't read and write. The king's court could read and write. The king, the queen, the kids of the royal family, they could read and write. Some noblemen, and their families could read and write. But then when you start dwindling down to the regular workers and such, nah, not so much. Not so much. So when he said that, that's what made me think about that. Not everybody in ancient Egypt could read and write. And the point that I'm making for that is that when racist white people introduced slavery in America, one of their main goals was to make sure that we as black people could not read and write. See, back then in Egypt, in Africa, it was about social status. You know, if you could afford to go to school, then you would learn how to read and write. But in America, it was more about dominancy. You will not learn how to read and write. If I catch you with a book, I'll kill your mama. It's the same thing, but then the reasoning behind it is different. People in ancient Egypt couldn't read and write because they couldn't afford schooling. People in America, born as slaves, couldn't read and write because it was forbidden. It was a social law. It might have been a illegal thing to read and write. So there's a lot of stuff going on between the old world in Africa and the past of America. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
And along the base of the statue and on top of the scroll are hieroglyphs. And basically, it says, I'm the king's deputy, and it says, I'm a straight arrow. I'm a law and order candidate. I'll give you a little quote from the statue what it says. It says, now remember, he's an important official under Tutankhamun. It says, I am the recorder of royal laws, who gives direction to the courtiers. Wise in speech, there's nothing I ignore without forgetting my charge. So he's law and order. He sets things right. Interestingly, by the way, the statue talks about the gods. Now, this is under Tutankhamun. It shows how quickly things are going back to normal. Horemheb is associating himself particularly with the god Thoth, the god of writing, the god of really law and order, right, keeping the records. So things are going back to normal, and Horemheb is all for it. So Horemheb had this career under Tutankhamun, and then he becomes the next pharaoh. Now, he does some really strange things. I mean, almost unique. One of the things he does is he acts as if all the subsequent pharaohs up to Amenhotep III never existed. Now, what I mean by that is this. Horemheb ruled for about 28 years, roughly. If you look at the records that Horemheb's scribes kept towards the end of his reign, it says he ruled for 58 years. Now, what's going on? Horemheb is totally ignoring the reigns of actually 4 pharaohs. Let me explain. He's pretending that this heresy period, anything connected with Amarna, when they tried to change the religion, when the military was allowed to go downhill, he is pretending that it never happened. He will wipe out the records of Akhenaten, the heretic, also Tutankhamun, because he was the son of the heretic. He'll even wipe out Ai's records, because he was an advisor to Akhenaten. He will wipe out every trace of this heresy, and he will say, my reign comes right after Amenhotep III. So he's really adding, in a sense, 30 years to his reign, because if you figure out who ruled when, Akhenaten ruled for 17 years, Tutankhamun for about 10, so that's 27, and then we've got Ai, 3, you get about 30 years there that he's just saying, never happened. It's a real 1984 type thing. He's rewriting history. And if you look at the king's lists, the list that all the pharaohs kept, you will never see Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, or Ai on those lists. There's even one other pharaoh that Horemheb wiped out, a mysterious pharaoh. We're really not sure who he was. We know his name, Smenkhare. He ruled for only 1 year as co-regent to Akhenaten. And we don't know who he was. Was he Akhenaten's brother? Was he Tutankhamun's brother? We just don't know. And some people think, remember I talked about Tomb 55, that tomb in the Valley of the Kings, that some people thought maybe that's the mummy of Tutankhamun, but it was a mix of things. It had a shrine for Queen Tai, it had this, it had that. Some people think that may be Snenkos, but Horemheb doesn't talk about him either. So there are really 4 kings who are disappeared. Right? So Horemheb is going to sort of wipe out all traces of the Amarna revolution. It's quite interesting. Now, he has some new policies that he's going to institute. The first is, he wants priests to be integrated into the army. You know, this is like the first military chaplains. This is the beginning of it. And the reason is that I think, I mean, this is my suggestion, Horemheb saw that the priests were so powerful that they could actually force Akhenaten to get out of Thebes. You know, when he's trying to close down the temples, and they're saying, wait a second, Akhenaten actually had to move out of Thebes, if you'll remember, to his new capital. Horemheb saw that. Horemheb knows priests are powerful, and why not integrate them into the military, having them as an ally, right? So he's thinking he's not going to let what happened to Akhenaten happen to him. Also, he's an army man. He knows the army very well. He has 2 commanders for the army. He knows the army is going to be big. It's a bureaucracy, and one person can't watch it all. So he has a commander for the north and a commander for the south. Because remember also, communications were difficult. You didn't just pick up the telephone. You know, a couple of days, a boat going north, boat going south. So he's shaking things up. Now he also has building projects. Remember, every pharaoh wants to build, wants to show that he's a great builder. And he goes to Karnak Temple, which is the greatest temple on earth, in Thebes. And he builds a pylon for himself. Now remember, also, he's an army man. He knows the army very well. He has 2 commanders for the army. He knows the army is going to be big. It's a bureaucracy, and one person can't watch it all. So he has a commander for the north and a commander for the south. Because remember also, communications were difficult. You didn't just pick up the telephone. You know, a couple of days, a boat going north, boat going south. So he's shaking things up. Now he also has building projects. Remember, every pharaoh wants to build, wants to show that he's a great builder. And he goes to Karnak Temple, which is the greatest temple on earth, in Thebes. And he builds a pylon for himself. Now remember, a pylon is a huge gateway. And they're huge, you know, they're like 100 feet high. And the reason you build a pylon is that it gives you a large surface that you can write on to tell about how great you are. And they almost have the same scenes. You always have the same scenes. The king is smiting his enemies. The king is making offerings to the gods. And he actually builds 2 pylons called the 9th and 10th. All the pylons at Karnak are numbered. He builds the 9th and 10th pylons. But he does it in an interesting way. Remember, these are people. These are real people we're talking about. These are places that you can still walk today. Think about what had happened. Akhenaten had built his temples at Karnak. Then he moves to Thebes. Then he moves away from Thebes to Amarna. Akhenaten's temples are at Karnak. And now Akhenaten dies, and everybody's going back to Thebes, and you still have these temples to this god, the Aten, that nobody really particularly likes, right? So a reminder of a bad time. Well, our man Horemheb builds his 9th pylon out of the blocks of Akhenaten's temple. He takes down the temple, right? It must have been a kind of sore, open sore, reminding people of hard times. So he takes all of these blocks, you know, like 40,000 of them, takes them down. They're smaller blocks. They're not like pyramid blocks. They're about, I'd say 2.5 feet wide. You know, 2 men can lift one fairly easily. And he takes all these blocks, which are carved with scenes of Akhenaten worshiping the Aten, and he uses them as the fill inside his 9th pylon. He packs the pylon inside, so he doesn't have to quarry stone. It's a cheap source of stone. You know, it's only a couple 100 yards away, and he builds his pylon out of Akhenaten's temples. Now, there's a kind of curious irony to all this. By taking down the temple and putting him inside his pylon, he preserved Akhenaten's temple. He preserved it. And in the 1920s, when there was restoration work on Horemheb's pylon and they had to take down his pylon, they discovered all these blocks. And that's that's when they tried to reconstruct on paper Akhenaten's temples by using a computer. As I was telling you, you photograph each block, and you try to say, well, we've got the head of a pharaoh. Where is a block that has the shoulders of a pharaoh? Maybe it matches. And that's how we reconstructed what Akhenaten's temple looked like. But it's because Horemheb tore it down. Right? Now, he does other things. He usurps all of Tutankhamun's monuments. Now, think about this. He was the king's deputy under Tutankhamun. That was his, really, heyday almost. Until he became pharaoh, of course. But it doesn't matter. Every monument that Tutankhamun had been advised to erect by probably, Horemheb takes Tutankhamun's name, carves it out, and puts his own. That's why it's so hard to find any information about Tutankhamun. Remember I said he's the mystery king? He's the most famous king in history, but we don't know anything about him? Because they were erasing all traces of him. He was associated with this heresy time, the Amarna heresy. His father was the heretic pharaoh.
So, another parallel. This king wants to erase from history what happened with King Tut and his father. Didn't want nobody to talk about it. Didn't want nobody to bring it up. So he's going way out of his way to make things happen. You know, scratching people's name out and just doing all kinds of other stuff, disassembling temples and buildings and using the stones to build his own. It's wow. It's crazy. Because when you come to America, a similar thing happened. The racist white people, slave owners and such, they purposely wanted to separate families so that we wouldn't have a direct link to our past. They wanted to keep us illiterate and broken. Well, guys, that's all I have for today. As usual, take care, be safe. I'll chat with you later.